Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. I was going to go live a little while ago, but apparently either my computer is too slow or something else is going on that I can't live stream without a lot of buffering. So I've given up on the live stream idea and I'm just recording this. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about today was the events of the day in terms of the vote for Speaker of the House and the efforts by people like me and hopefully you to force the vote, meaning to get the Squad or other progressive members of Congress to pressure Nancy Pelosi to bring Medicare for All for a vote before the House floor by threatening to withhold their vote for Nancy Pelosi until she agreed to do that. Now, as the Speaker of the House, she has the power to make that decision, to bring any bill she wants to the floor of the House. The House itself has that power if, I believe it's the majority of the House votes to bring a bill to the floor for a vote. But the Speaker can do that all by herself, him or herself. And so that was the idea. And just prior to the vote, the new members of the Squad, which include Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, these people right here, and I'm not on that. Let's see. Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush are the new members of the so-called Squad, which originally consisted of Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib. Even though there are other members of Congress who were considered progressive, such as Pramila Jayapal or Barbara Lee, these four women who were voted in 2018 were branded the Squad because they were sort of young whippersnappers with a progressive reputation who were all voted in at the same time. And anyway, two more members of the Squad were added, and so Jamal Bowman tweets here, "Our Squad is big." I'm not sure if 6 people is big, but it's big enough that if they had wanted to, they could have used their power to pressure Nancy Pelosi into either holding a vote on Medicare for All or giving up the speakership. Now, as you can see, Dr. Bowman's, he's got a doctorate in education. Dr. Bowman's tweet had a bit of a ratio here, 1,000 comments to 485 retweets. And the reason why is that this big bad Squad voted for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, apparently without extracting any concessions whatsoever from her. And as I've talked about on the show recently, and as you know, if you've been following things lately, there's been a big controversy about this whole idea of force the vote. So people have claimed, well, so you force a vote on Medicare for All, and you lose, so what? What does that gain you? Well, as I discussed on the on the show the other day, this would be a historic event. Even though there have been Medicare for All or single-payer bills floating around in Congress since the early 1990s, there's never been enough support for them to actually be voted on in the full House. They always die in committee or stay locked up in committee, where Pramila Jayapal's Medicare For All bill that's in the House remains today. And people would have been who've opposed this have been basically personally attacking Jimmy Dore, the initiator of the idea, as well as others who have been supporting it. Brianna Joy Gray, another supporter of the idea, who was Bernie Sanders' press secretary and is known other than that as a political commentator who writes for, I believe, Current Affairs now. She was with The Intercept previously, and she has a YouTube show, or a podcast, I should say. But anyway, she's on board with the Force the Vote campaign, has been a big promoter of it, wrote a very nice article in Current Affairs, which I will post again in the description of this video, as I did last time. A splendid article that lays out the arguments for it. But anyway, one of the opponents of this idea, Jamal Bowman, Ben Dixon, basically called her an Uncle Tom, which I have no idea what his reasoning was for that, but there's basically just been this big effort to smear any prominent person who is supportive of this idea. Interestingly enough, not all prominent people who have been supportive of this idea. Crystal Ball has not been smeared. Cornel West has not been smeared. And there are probably some others. But they pick out certain people that they can deem to be controversial and worth canceling, and go after them. And that's in lieu, of course, of making any arguments in favor of some alternative idea for pushing the Medicare for All debate and building a movement for it. They don't seem that interested in it for the most part. So one of the claims that's been made is Cenk Uygur of TYT has been claiming that, he said this repeatedly, Kevin McCarthy, the Republican nominee for Speaker, would have become Speaker if the squad had gone along with Jimmy's plan. So Cenk says, for all people pushing #fraud squad, do you understand that if all 10 Justice Democrats had voted present, the GOP leader, Kevin McCarthy, would be Speaker right now? What would that have accomplished? Easy being destructive. You have to come up with a plan for being constructive. So Jimmy responded by parodying him. I know this isn't how it works at all, because I've had it explained to me a million times now by #ForceTheVote advocates, but for some reason I'm not embarrassed to keep pushing this obvious lie that GOP could take speakership. Please donate, it's fun. Cenk Uygur, #fraud squad. Well, I mean, it is literally true that Kevin McCarthy could have become Speaker, but for that to have happened, what would be required is the people not voting for Nancy Pelosi would have had to simply not vote. As Cenk says, vote present or abstain or what have you. But all Jimmy and other advocates of Force the Vote were saying is, they should withhold their vote from Pelosi, those who wanted a floor vote on Medicare for All. But they weren't saying that they weren't saying how they should vote. Obviously, members of Congress know the rules about how electing a Speaker of the House works. And maybe you don't, because actually I had to look this up and be completely straight on it today, because I had a little bit of a misunderstanding. But basically, what has to happen is that a majority of those who vote have to vote for a person in order for that person to be elected Speaker of the House. So in other words, if somebody votes present, i.e. they abstain, they don't vote, they aren't counted as having voted, obviously. So yes, it's possible that if a whole bunch of people had abstained from voting for Pelosi, even though Kevin McCarthy would not have gotten a majority of votes from those present for the vote, he would have gotten a majority of the votes that were cast, and thus he could have become Speaker of the House. However, unless they actually wanted, a Republican to become Speaker of the House, clearly this people in the squad know the rules, and they, if they were at all interested in pushing for a vote on Medicare for All, they would have simply voted for someone else. Maybe they could have voted for Barbara Lee. Really anybody who was not a Republican, or anybody who wasn't Kevin McCarthy, I guess. They could have voted for them, and Kevin McCarthy couldn't possibly have won. The Republicans are the minority party by roughly 10 seats, I think it is. So there's no way. It's mathematically impossible for Kevin McCarthy to have become Speaker just because not all the Democrats voted for Nancy Pelosi. However, what actually happened was these guys, these 6 squad members, plus Barbara Lee, Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna, other members of the House considered to be progressives, they all voted for Nancy Pelosi. Every single one of them. So, what I had to say about this was, I'll just, what I tweeted was, now is never the time, apparently. There doesn't seem to be even any time, even the middle of a pandemic, where 350,000 people, or more than 350,000 people, have died from coronavirus. Millions and millions of people have gotten sick. Some of them very sick with long-term serious symptoms such as confusion and other cognitive symptoms, heart damage, all kinds of bad shit can happen to you from COVID other than dying. And one of the bad things in the United States that can happen to you if you have COVID is you can go bankrupt for medical bills because we don't have universal health care. And one of the arguments against Medicare for All made by a number of politicians in the campaign leading up to the election was, well, hey, maybe people are satisfied with their insurance they have through their employer. You want to take that away from them? They might be happy with their coverage from their employer. Well, guess what? Nobody's making that argument anymore because 15 million people who lost their jobs have, with that, lost their health insurance over the course of the last few months. So that argument goes out the window. And, with 45 million people uninsured and tens of millions more having difficulty affording typically very inadequate insurance coverage, where despite paying hundreds of dollars a month for insurance, we have high deductibles. There are lots of things that insurance doesn't cover. there were all kinds of horror stories on the Force the Vote town hall the other night where people were talking about getting socked with you know, bills in the tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars that their health insurance would not cover. Jimmy Dore himself, the person who proposed this idea, the reason why he's so passionate about Medicare for All, and I think he mentioned a couple of days ago that he's done about 100 videos on his YouTube channel advocating for Medicare for All, is that he himself went through a devastating illness where it was very difficult to diagnose. It turned out to be a very rare and very debilitating bone disease. Left him, essentially crippled for a little while because his bones were crumbling. And his insurance company, he had good insurance, I believe, through his wife. She was a teacher at the time, but it wouldn't cover his treatment. So he and his wife went bankrupt. He was in terrible health. Had to be wheeled out on stage to do his comedy act. And he and his wife Steph went bankrupt trying to cover his medical bills. So that's just one of who knows how many stories Americans have about this utterly shitty healthcare system that we have, and so this so-called squad is trying to con us into believing that they're gonna give us health care and a Green New Deal and all this other stuff. And meanwhile, they can't even stand up to Nancy Pelosi whatsoever, even though there are no discernible negative consequences that could have occurred had they done so. And I talked last time about what the upside of Force the Vote is. Again, Brianna Joy Gray lays this out very nicely, and I'll repost the article about it. But basically, there's three possible outcomes that could have occurred here. One, the one that did, is that nobody really pressured Pelosi to bring Medicare for All to the floor. They just guaranteed their vote to her without extracting any discernible concessions. Well, what does that do for us? Well, it shows us that basically we can't trust any of them. None of them are really willing to fight it for us, at least not so far. Maybe when we ratchet up the pressure on these progressives, maybe they will fight the establishment. But right now, they're unwilling to. They're opportunists, they're sellouts, they're, as many people have been calling them, the fraud squad. So that's what we know as a result of today's events. We don't really have any allies in Congress at this point, unfortunately. When push comes to shove, when they need to put up a fight for us, they're not willing to fight. Another thing that could have happened was they could have pressured Pelosi to bring the bill to the floor by withholding their vote, voting for somebody else. And Pelosi could have said no, and she would have lost her speakership. They probably would have had to go through several rounds of votes, and eventually somebody would have become speaker, and who knows if that person would have agreed to the squad's demands if they had made those demands. But in any case, somebody would have become speaker, and it wouldn't have been a Republican, because Democrats are not going to vote for a Republican, and not being stupid, they're not going to allow a scenario to develop where a Republican could become speaker, because they have the majority. And a third thing that could happen is they could have brought the Pelosi could have brought the bill to the floor. It would have been voted on. It probably would have been voted down, but it would have been a historic event. It would have been the first time that Medicare for All had been voted on by a full body of Congress. And, you know, that would have provided an opportunity for discussion on the floor of the House. It would have been publicized. It would have generated a lot of public discussion. It could really have been a spark for the movement for Medicare for All. This could be too. This failure of the squad to exert any pressure, kind of exposing them for not really being our allies. It could galvanize people into seeking other paths and realizing that they can't depend on members of Congress to be a leadership in this movement. And that's an important lesson that I think we all have to realize, is that no matter how nice their rhetoric sounds, elected officials, particularly at the federal level, there might be some exceptions at the local level, such as I forget her name, the congresswoman out in, the city councilwoman out in Seattle. But at least at the federal level, there's nobody who's a leader of any movement. They're not going to be leaders. At best, they're going to be followers. At worst, they're going to stab us in the back like they did today. Okay, so, would it have been the end of the world if Medicare for All had come to the floor of the House and not passed, which, that's likely what would have happened. Well, no. We would have seen, in a better way than we can see from who is or isn't a co-sponsor of the bill, who really does or doesn't stand behind Medicare for All. And we could put the issue on the table of public discussion and contribute to efforts to building a movement that in the long run could overcome resistance to Medicare for All and get it through. And there's historical precedent for doing that sort of thing. In Britain, in the UK, during the mid-20th century, they forced the vote on their Medicare for All type system, the National Health Service, and it failed 21 times. But eventually they were able to get it through. So it just takes persistence and continuing to build pressure on politicians to do the right thing, and eventually they will if the pressure is high enough. That's what happened in the United States when Roosevelt and Congress were basically forced to enact the New Deal. But one thing I wanted to talk about was another instance of using a tactic for forcing the vote right here in the United States. Basically, using the very same tactic that those of us in the force the vote movement were trying to get AOC and the other members of the squad to use on Pelosi. Advocates of abolishing slavery did the very same thing way back in the early 1800s. I thought I had this underlined here, but let's just go through this article together, shall we? I just skimmed through it earlier, but it's very interesting. It's entitled What the Antebellum Abolitionists Can Teach Us About AOC and Medicare for All. It's by a guy named Corey Brooks and appeared in Jacobin magazine recently. I'll put the link in the video description. So he says the debate on the left about Nancy Pelosi's speakership candidacy and whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and allies should threaten to vote against it in exchange for a floor vote on Medicare for All is acrimonious but not entirely new. There is, in fact, a quite striking historical precedent, and he doesn't mean the Tea Party. In fact, anti-slavery radicals back in the 1830s formed a third party, the Liberty Party, that was dedicated to opposing slavery. Whereas the two major parties at the time, the Democrats and the Whigs, the Republicans didn't exist yet, they were pro-slavery parties. And so you did have lesser evil pro-slavery candidates, so to speak, who were supportive of slavery and in many cases owned slaves, as did Henry Clay, the 1844 Whig candidate for president. But they didn't support adding new slave states to the country as the U.S. expanded west. So that was the lesser evil of that day. So in 1840, a small group of political abolitionists created a Liberty Party, and they won just a fraction of a percent in 1840 when they were a brand new party, and they put up a presidential candidate, James Birney. Then in 1844, they had a little bit better success, winning whole 2% of the vote. They were never able to elect their own congressman, but on more of a state and local level, they did wield some power. And in those places, they forced major party organizations, usually the Whigs, to nominate anti-slavery candidates for Congress. And so it's a similar situation to today when you're sending nominally pro-Medicare For All candidates like AOC or Jamal Bowman or Rashida Tlaib to Congress nowadays. And so then they get to Washington. When such men went to Washington, it was all men in those days. Political abolitionists put pressure on them to try and get them to refuse to vote for whoever the Whigs put up for Speaker of the House. So political abolitionists were livid when several anti-slavery men ended up casting their votes for Virginia slaveholder Robert M.T. Hunter. And it's a very similar situation to today. The Whigs' margin was so narrow that when he finally won, he won by only 3 votes, and it took 10 ballots. But these 3 supposed anti-slavery congressmen refused to withhold their vote from this slave owner. 2 years later, 6 members of the Whig caucus, outraged at their party's insistence on elevating Kentucky slaveholder John White to the speakership. Sound familiar? Now we're outraged at people elevating anti-universal health care Congressperson Nancy Pelosi to the speakership. So the Whig caucus members did finally start casting votes for someone other than the Whigs' main candidate. But it didn't work because the Whigs had a bigger majority. So you see what lost opportunity this was today when the Democrats' majority was very small, and they could have blocked Pelosi from becoming Speaker until they had extracted whatever concessions they wanted, and they failed to do so. But it took a few more years before they had the opportunity to pull this ploy again, where the margin between the Whigs and the Democrats was close enough that they could pull it off. Eventually, the Liberty Party merged with some disaffected members of the Whigs and the Democrats. They all came together to form a new party, the Free Soil Party, which was not as radical as the Liberty Party, but it was a lot bigger, and it was, moderately opposed to slavery. I'm not sure exactly what their position was, but it was sort of in between the position of Henry Clay, who was a slave owner but didn't want new slave states, and the abolitionists, who were just, slavery is immoral, it has to be abolished immediately. And they had enough members in the party to actually elect congressmen, maybe a dozen or so. And so the House Speaker election began. I believe this was in about 1850. And it took them 59 rounds of voting. And actually a change of rules where they decided to allow someone who just got a plurality of the votes, rather than a majority of votes cast, which is the current and usual rule. And so a slaveholder was picked. So the Free Soilers didn't win that time, but they succeeded in prolonging the struggle over who was going to become Speaker, which created quite a spectacle. And so the Free Soil Party was all of a sudden at the center of national political debate, along with his criticisms aimed at both parties for their temporizing on the slavery issue. And for many abolitionists, that was precisely the point. The stalemate made it obvious to the whole American people. Free Soil party member Charles Durkee wrote that the great struggle is between the slavery propagandists and the slavery restrictionists. And ultimately, the result of that was the disintegration of the Whig Party within a few years. So one of the two major parties at the time in the U.S. went poof. And in its place, the Republican Party was founded, which included members of the Free Soil Party, as well as people who broke off from the Whigs and the Democrats, as well as some abolitionists who previously had not been part of a party, because the abolitionists didn't necessarily agree that they should even participate in the political system. They were divided between people who supported liberty and then later the Free Soil Party, and people who were like, fuck electoral politics, let's overthrow the damn government. So anyway, what happened from there. Intermediate step before Lincoln became president was the Republicans, the moderately anti-slavery new party, won the majority of congressional votes in 1856, and were able to elect a Speaker of the House. So 1856 was, he says, perhaps the single greatest turning point in solidifying the newly found GOP's role as a major party in American politics. So what, he asked, do these antebellum, pre-abolition of slavery, speaker fights tell us about today's controversy? Left commentators are correct when they argue that speakership elections constitute a rare opportunity for balance of power politics in a closely divided House. However doomed to fail in the short run, the spectacle such events create can have real consequences for long-term political and policy discourse. The North, despite its temporizing, was growing increasingly anti-slavery. So when its representatives were exposed as craven politicians, fraud squad, who would always prioritize party loyalty over anti-slavery, it mattered for Northern political public opinion. Perhaps AOC and her allies believe a similar dynamic could take hold in the fight over universal health care, or perhaps AOC and her allies are just total sellouts who can't be depended on to fight for universal health care of much of anything else. I'm editorializing there, and that wasn't in the article. Of course, there's a key difference, he says. Liberty and Free Soil men sought no less than the destruction of both of the major parties of their day. They didn't care if attacking moderately pro-slavery Whigs gave somewhat more pro-slavery Democrats control of the House. Obviously they did succeed in destroying the Whigs. So certainly the left-wing Democrats, the Squad and so forth, as part of the second most enthusiastic capitalist party in the world, behind the Republicans, but not by much, they are not interested in doing battle over this. So a tactical question remains, he says, how to balance the very real value of spectacle for the cause of radical change against whatever potential seat at the table might be sacrificed by being obtrusive. Well, AOC has already lost a committee position, and they're not fighting for anything at this point anyway. Pelosi doesn't owe them anything. So I don't see what they have to lose. They're all in gerrymandered Democratic districts, so it's not like it's very likely that a Republican is going to beat them. So the worst that could happen is they'll be primaried by a corporate Democrat. And if they're fighting for what's right, they'll have a lot of popular support. So I don't see this as an issue. And he concludes, perhaps they've simply made a considered tactical judgment that this is not the moment to play hardball for the sake of spectacle. But that begs the question, when is the moment? Apparently now is never the time, according to according to the Squad. I see I didn't show you the article. There it is. I apologize for that. But I will put a description of it, or a link to it, in the description of the video, so that you can read all about it for yourself. But interesting history lesson there that shows us that this can be a very effective tactic. It doesn't necessarily instantly create change, but by heightening the visibility of the issue, it can serve as a tool to help build a movement for whatever the change is, whether it be abolishing slavery or, in this case, bringing us at long last, 70 or 80 years after most other countries, universal health care. So, we just have to keep fighting. Remember that our slogan should not be "Power concedes nothing without a polite request," as AOC would apparently have it, but power concedes nothing without a demand. That's what Frederick Douglass said back in the day. Power concedes nothing without a demand. That's the only way that abolitionists were able to do away with slavery. That's the only way that labor movement activists and workers in the 1930s were able to push through a New Deal. It was just saying, no, I'm not going to let you walk all over me and pay me a pittance for working my ass off all day. If you're going to keep doing that, I'm not going to work, and neither are any of my colleagues, and you're not going to be able to produce your products, you're not going to be able to make a profit, you're not going to be able to stay in business. So how do you like them apples? One key thing that workers in the 30s did was they occupied the factories, so they couldn't bring in replacement workers. But anyway, enough of that history lesson. My point is that if our members of Congress who are supposedly on our side, who claim to support Medicare for All or a Green New Deal or free college or other important political reforms, cutting the military budget, if they claim to support these things, but they're not willing to fight for them, if they're not willing to make demands, if they're not willing to use power when they have it, which they did today, they had power, and they didn't fucking use it, then they are useless to us. They cannot be the impetus for a successful movement for universal health care or anything else. That has to come from us. We, the people, the grassroots, are the leaders that we've been looking for. We're not going to get leadership from up there on the hill in D.C. Not going to happen. So we'll just have to keep at it and keep putting the pressure on members of Congress to force the vote on Medicare for All any way we can, and keep organizing our movement to eventually make this happen. Okay, well, that's all I had to say for today. Please like and subscribe and share the video, and I will see